right, so let's get this class started with basic information about Copic markers. So first of all, there are 4 different types of Copic markers. There is the wide marker, the original one, which is a square shape. There is the chow, and then there is the sketch. Now, the wide one has this huge tip to it. So it's great if you do a lot of filling in large areas. If you're wanting to use it for smaller images or wanting to use Copics for smaller images or things, this one really is far too big for what you need. And to be honest, I never actually use it, which is why it's completely dried out on me. It's been sitting in a drawer for probably about 10 years. The original Copic marker, the one that's the square shape, has a chisel tip on one end and a fine tip on another end. So this is great if you have fine areas to color in, and then the chisel tip is also great for bigger areas as well. This one I tend not to use a whole lot because the sketch and the chow have a brush tip and a chisel tip, and I typically like the brush tip. That's my favorite tip to use. I have a couple of the original ones simply because I went to an event and they were given away with, well, it was a Copic certification course, and they were given away with that. So that's why I have those guys. So the only difference between the chow and the sketch is the barrel shape. They both have a brush tip on one end and then a chisel tip on the other end. The chows are round, so they tend to roll around on your desk a little bit more, whereas the sketches are oval. They don't do that. The sketches hold more ink than the chows, but the chows tend to be a little bit less expensive. When I was first starting out, I wasn't sure if I was going to love alcohol markers or not, so I started by getting sets of chows because they were more economical than the sketches. I ended up absolutely loving them. So as I've elaborated on my collection, the ones that I don't have in sets of chows, I've been buying them in the sketch markers. So the thing that makes Copic markers great, the alcohol-based ink, you can sit and you can color the same area over and over and over and over again, and your paper is never going to pill. Whereas with a dye-based marker, this is a Tombow marker, within a few seconds, really, my paper's already starting to pill. And what I mean by pill is it's starting to break down and some of the paper fibers are coming up. Whereas this here is still completely smooth. I can go over that as many times as I want and it's never going to start pilling. So to do blending with the dye-based markers, you have to end up working quite quick, otherwise your papers are going to start to break down. Whereas the Copic markers, you can take your time doing your blending and your highlighting and that sort of thing, and your paper is never going to start breaking down. The one thing to keep in mind though is with the Copic markers, they do bleed to the other side of your paper. So you'll notice throughout this that I'll be working on some scrap paper so that the paper underneath absorbs the ink that I'm using. The other thing you'll notice is when I'm placing my paper down, I'm going to be a little bit careful. I'll just do this just to show you. Say for instance, there's a big blotch of burgundy on my scrap paper. If I were to go and start coloring yellow here, you'll notice after a little bit some of that burgundy starts to pull up and it starts to bleed into here. And of course, while I'm demonstrating it, it's probably not going to happen. So you'll want to make sure, yeah, it's not happening. This one's not bleeding in as much as the burgundy did. But you'll want to make sure that as you work on different projects, you're moving them to a different area of your scrap paper so that you're not pulling up colors from your scrap paper accidentally. The other thing to notice as you're coloring is your like if you're working inside a stamped image, you want to work just shy of the line of the image because the Copic ink, the alcohol ink, does tend to go out a little bit as it is drying and as it's settling. It's one of those things that's a learning curve. as you get used to the ink, you'll have an easier time with it. You'll know how far away from the ink or from the line to go. If you go right to the line and it pools outside of it, sometimes you can fix it, sometimes you can't, depending on really on the ink color. The darker colors are harder to fix than the lighter colors, but I will show you how to fix that in an upcoming segment. The other thing, when starting out, start out with images that have thick lines to them. That's going to give you a little bit of forgiveness and just make it a little bit easier on you. So for this class, I'm going to be using a bunch of clip art from online that I've printed onto the paper that I like to use. You want to make sure that you're using it on paper that is good for Copics. This one here is really nice and smooth. You don't want to use it with something that has too much tooth to it, otherwise the ink is going to spread more than you're going to want it. You're going to have to play around with a few different papers to find out what works for you. It's a personal preference thing. There is, like Copics themselves, they do make their own paper. It tends to be a little bit pricey, so you might want to just see what you have around you, test papers that you already have, and just see how those markers work with it. The other thing you want to make sure that you're using, if you're using stamped images, using inks that are compatible with Copics. To just stamp and then color, I like Memento Tuxedo Black. If you're going to stamp and emboss, I use either one of these. One is Versacolor Ultimate Pigment, and then the other one is Brilliance Graphite Black. These ones here I emboss with clear embossing powder. You don't want to use colored embossing powders simply because if you use the alcohol markers with them, they can start to break down the powders. So you want to be a little bit careful with that. We don't want to ruin your markers when we're playing. The other thing with alcohol-based markers, with the Copic markers, is they're a little bit more expensive when you're starting out. It is a bit of an investment, but the great thing about them is you can refill them and you can also change the tip. So if you happen to have a tip that goes funky or goes dry or whatnot, you can replace it. So in order to change a tip, you're just going to take a scrap of paper, pull your tip out, and then you're going to replace it with the new one. I'm pulling up the chisel tip and I don't have any chisel tips to replace, but you just slide the new one in. Copic does have a pair of tweezers that you can use for this. I find just using a scrap piece of paper works. Typically when you're doing this, you're going to do it on a dry marker, not one that is full of ink, so you're not going to necessarily get ink all over. The other thing that I love about Copics is that you can refill them. So when they run out of ink, when they're a little bit dry, you simply refill them. Typically while I'm coloring with them, I'll just do what I just did there and put a few drops of ink on the tips. If I'm not coloring with them anymore, what I'll do is I'll pull that tip out and I'll put some ink right into the barrel, and then I'll let it sit and let the ink disperse throughout the marker. And that is going to make it so that it's good for the next time that I want to color with it. So that is all I have to share with you right now. Next video, we're going to go into talking about the Copic blender pen. Most people think that it's meant for blending, and it's not, and I'll show you why. We'll see you in the next one.